Tensions between Washington and Caracas are growing. US President Donald Trump and Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro have been far from best buds since Trump returned to office. But after at least 5 US military strikes on boats in the Caribbean in the past few weeks, Trump has said that he has authorized the CIA to use lethal force in Venezuela. Trump says it is because Venezuela has emptied its prisons into the United States and because of drugs flowing in from the country. But many have also said that these are just excuses to push for regime change. So what's really going on? And what's going on in the wider rim of the Caribbean? Welcome along to this podcast from Geopolitical Futures. I am your host, Christian Smith, and we are joined by Geopolitical Futures Chairman and Founder George Friedman. George, you have been writing in an article that is free to read for anybody who would like to go to geopoliticalfutures.com about the current situation between the US and Venezuela. Let's start with Venezuela. Remind us of the political situation there.
Well, Venezuela is a very wealthy country. It has major oil reserves, and it used to be very close to the United States. A leftist government is elected, currently chaired by Maduro, who has both weakened Venezuela profoundly and turned it into a nation at once hostile to the United States and running, very honestly, drug cartels or drug cartels running countries. It's hard to figure out which is which, that are sending drugs to the United States. But there are much broader issues involved here. We should not think just of Venezuela. We should think of the Caribbean in general and a very old and troubled relationship between the United States and that region.
Well, yes, I mean, speaking of that, the geopolitics of the Americas generally, and particularly the long history of the relationship between the US and the countries to its south, I mean, remind us of that relationship, the relationship with Venezuela, the relationship with the rest of Latin America.
Well, you first have to begin with a very old doctrine back in the 19th century, the Monroe Doctrine. Monroe Doctrine held that where the United States would not get involved in Europe, the European countries must not become entangled in Western Hemispheric affairs. Now, this was a doctrine, not something the cable would carry out, and certainly we got entangled in Europe. But there's still an underlying principle that the Western Hemisphere must, if possible, remain outside the bounds of the Europeans. So when in the First World War, the Germans suggested to the Mexicans, why don't you go to war with the United States? And that was intercepted. That was not just a violation of the Monroe Doctrine, which is not law to anyone, but also triggered an American involvement in Europe. So when we look at this issue, the two are entangled. But the U.S. claims that no European power must be involved in the area. And the Russians certainly were during the Cold War, deeply involved in many countries.
And the Monroe Doctrine, I mean, it's 200 years old now. I mean, the idea that other countries can't be involved in the Western Hemisphere. And I would ask you as well if that has changed. You know, do you think that's changed to the extent that it now extends to China?
It really expresses a fundamental American strategic interest. The United States is, as I've said many times before, defended by two vast oceans from the Eastern Hemisphere. The United States regards the Eastern Hemisphere as an ongoing bloodbath, somewhere, somehow. After the World War II, we were deeply involved in the Eastern Hemisphere, but we didn't want the same thing happening in the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine was simply a statement of our desires and our policies, not that we could enforce them. But as we became more powerful, we could do that better. So what the Monroe Doctrine really states is American strategy, which is when foreign powers get involved in Latin America, we oppose that. It's not economics, it's primarily military. The Chinese have been economically involved, but we have not claimed that doctrine is something that they shouldn't do. The Russians were covertly involved during the Cold War. And so there's that dimension that we have to talk about.
And I mean, nowadays, is it not possible though? Since 200 years ago, there was many more empires, colonialism, that sort of thing. Therefore, more ideas of puppet kings being set up in Latin America. I mean, has that not changed now? Do you think? Do you think that these fundamentals still remain the same?
It is almost impossible for either Europe or Asia to attack the United States proper. The U.S. command of the seas is massive. It's a long distance to wage a war. Latin America is much closer. Mexico is closer. Central America is closer. South America is closer. So from a standpoint of American national strategy, what's going on in the Eastern Hemisphere may stay in the Eastern Hemisphere, and we may get involved there. But if you come into the Western Hemisphere, you're now much closer to us. So, for example, if the Germans, Nazis, anyone else, the Russians, had a base in South America from which to operate, then the homeland itself, the United States, would be under attack. So it's a rational foreign policy. Expressed as doctrine simply means we're going to go fight anybody who comes into this area. But if you take a look at the map, it's a rational policy. We don't want major foreign powers operating in the Southern Hemisphere. It is certainly an intrusion to the national sovereignty of South American nations. But then history is always intrusion.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's interesting because in your piece, you wrote something along the lines of the policy itself, the Monroe Doctrine, sort of implies that, there is no need for consent from these Latin American powers to this, i.e., if they decide to go in a particular way that threatens the US's interests, the US will go in and change that so it doesn't. I mean, is that fair?
Oh, no, it's not fair. Since what has history and reality been fair? What it does say, however, is that these countries, for their interests, cannot be used as bases from which foreign powers can operate against the United States. It also implies that if that happens, those countries will be in a state of war. So in one sense, you can claim this is protecting South America. On the other sense, you can claim that we're intruding in their international affairs, as all great powers do to other powers.
Looking at what's going on with Venezuela specifically before we come on to the wider Caribbean for a moment, I mean, do you think Trump is pushing for regime change there now? Or do you think...
Absolutely. I mean, he wants Maduro out. There is a connection between Maduro and Russia. There were, from the Cold War, groups operating in Latin America, covert operations. And Maduro emerged from that even after the Cold War was over. He also has very quiet, very intense relationships with the Russians. And so we look at Venezuela in two ways. One as a cartel member, having members, the other as a potential base for Russian operations in the Western Hemisphere. Because during the Cold War, Latin America was a base for Russian operations, not only in Cuba, but they were very closely tied in many cases in places like Colombia with the various resistance groups, left-wing quasi-military forces, but they were linked sometimes to the cartels as they emerged in the 1980s. So from the American point of view, they were involved in Central America, Nicaragua, fighting leftists, also dealing with cartels. There has been a historic relationship between these cartels. The Soviets at that time encouraged them because they wanted to destabilize the region. Not, I think, because they were drug dealers, but at the same time, they posed a problem in the 1980s, which the United States does not want to see reemerged. If we remember the various battles and semi-battles that were fought, Cuba is at the center of it in one way, but indeed countries like Colombia, sometimes Chile, uh, Venezuela, all these countries had these covert operations by the Russians going on to destabilize us, and they worked to some extent with the cartels.
And I mean, remind us again of perhaps that kind of, well, the modern setting with regards to Russia and Central and South and Latin America, really. I mean, it's still very active with Cuba, still very active with Venezuela.
Well, what happened here was this. The United States started threatening to send Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. These missiles had very long range, striking deep, very accurately, very explosively in there. In the context of this, the Russians have now, in the last few months, very short period of time, signed a new understanding, military understanding, defense understanding with the Cubans. These relationships had to some extent atrophied after the fall of communism. They no longer had the communist dimension. And the death of Fidel Castro also changed somewhat Cuba. In the context of these threats about these missiles in Ukraine, the Russians, I think, were looking for a counter. The counter was obviously Cuba, which has always been a strategic asset, or tried to be a strategic asset of Russia. And by starting this, that flipped several switches in Washington, because then the option is for the Russians to base similar weapons in Cuba. And just as we would say the Ukrainians did this, they could say the Cubans did this, wasn't us. Now, I don't think the Cubans are crazy enough to start launching rockets at the United States, but this was a continuum of Russian involvement in Latin America, going back to the one single thing we cannot tolerate and couldn't. And let me explain why. The most important ports in the United States are those in the Gulf ports. They account on the Gulf of Mexico for about, a little over 1/2 of all imports and exports. There's one easy access out of there, and that is the Straits of Florida, point between Key West and Cuba, and that's 90 miles wide. There's another egress to the west, down toward the Yucatan Peninsula, but not nearly as used and professional. If the Russians were ever to cut, or any country cut, the lines in that area, South Florida Straits, that would cause a massive economic crisis for the United States. During the Cold War, when they went into the missiles in Cuba, they really missed an opportunity to really give us headaches with their submarines plowing outside the waters. Might have led to war. So every once in a while, the Russians send some sort of ship, something to visit Cuba, always coming through the straits and always reminding us of our vulnerability. So when we start seeing the Russians operating against, not only in Cuba, but in the Caribbean in general, we get very nervous, because this really is a vulnerable point for the United States. And so when we see Maduro at the southern side of the Caribbean, coming closer to the Russians and had been fairly close to them, we see them signing an agreement now with the Cubans that they had lapsed long ago. Then there's a question of national security. And as we can talk about, when they see the cartels, in the memory of many people who are old enough to remember the 1980s, they also see various left-wing groups supported by the Soviet Union operating sometimes in tandem with them. So there's a whole long story on this, and that story is triggering many memories, and it's a realistic situation.
Enjoying the show? Take a moment to follow and rate us on your preferred podcast platform. For video versions of the show and much, much more, subscribe on YouTube. And as always, you can find expert geopolitical analysis at geopoliticalfutures.com. I mean, break down for us what would happen if the US lost access to the Straits of Florida. You touched on it there, but I mean, would its economy be able to continue to operate as it is?
It would be able to operate because there's also the Yucatan Straits that we can use, which is much less efficient to get where they are. It would also hurt the Europeans, particularly Western Europeans. This is the route between Europe and the United States. And so it would certainly hurt both NATO, if you will, and the United States. And it would be a counter to actions that we would be taking, putting missiles that close to the Russians. This would be, from the Russian point of view, look, you put tomahawks here, we're going back to Cuba. You start fooling around with our access to the Black Sea and so on and so forth. We have options. They never exercised those options. They were very careful when they had forces in Cuba not to do this. But there is a memory, systematic memory of the fears of Russian submarines operating in the Caribbean, blocking American access to the Western Hemisphere, at the Eastern Hemisphere. So the Russians have not done that, and they've not come close to doing it, but they're playing the psychology.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people's reaction to that would be, that makes sense, but then isn't that really far-fetched? I mean, isn't the likelihood of Russia sort of trying to block the Straits of Florida a million years away if it were ever to happen at all?
Well, look at it this way. We're talking seriously about placing tomahawks in range not only of Moscow, but east of Moscow. We're talking about placing weapons, not nuclear weapons, but weapons that can be launched at them by a country they're at war with. That's already going to a place where we haven't been for a while. And if you're the Russians and you're taking this seriously, you're looking for a way to counter it, not with nuclear weapons, but some drones, missiles based. And the only place they can do that is Cuba. So in a way, the fact that we would arm the Ukrainians with these weapons, as many people would want to stop Russian aggression in Ukraine, not unreasonable, creates a new problem, and a very old problem. If the Americans are that close to Russia, as they always were, in a way, and they can use conventional weapons to strike at the Russians, well then, what's the counter of the Russians? Nuclear attacks? Wasting nuclear-capable missiles with conventional warheads? Well, Cuba was that place. And it was a place that kind of went quiet after the fall of communism. On the other hand, it comes back into play in a certain way. For that to come back into play, the Caribbean has to come back in play. So when you talk to Trump and he starts talking about the cartels and their dangers, there's a very reasonable thing to think that they're in Venezuela or in Colombia or many other countries in the region. But also to be thinking about going back to how the Russians exploited these cartels back in the end of the 20th century to empower them in a way, give them weapons, use them in a way to destabilize governments, okay? And so we go back to a very old picture, and history does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And so, what will the Russians do if the Americans say we're going to put Tomahawks in? You could say, well, it's a very unrealistic idea to revive operations in Cuba and Latin America. But on the other hand, what else would they do?
So, in many respects, is this Putin's sort of Khrushchev diplomatic ploy to get what he wants in Ukraine, that he's pressuring the US through this?
Well, it's a counter. It's not a credible counter because I don't think the Cubans are crazy enough to allow themselves to be used as a base for attacking Texas from Cuba. And I think it's a very weak move. But on the other hand, further Russian covert operations in Latin America itself, or overt presence, as in Venezuela, is a way to put the United States in a position where it feels threatened. So if we're threatening the Russians, it is rational for them to use the old threat they used to have. This is, in a way, the old saying is, history repeats itself twice. The first time is tragedy, the second time is farce. We're in the second phase of it being planned out, but it's the same sort of game on the earliest edges of its evolution, if it evolves. But if you take a look why I think Trump is always obsessing with the cartels, there really is a drug issue. But it's also the old memories among some of the people who were there of the time when the cartels and Russian covert operations sometimes meshed and moved along the same direction. So when he looks at Maduro and he looks at the cartels operating in Venezuela, it may well be, and I don't know this, but it's logical, that he and the people around him are imagining the times the Russians took advantage of the cartels to form a threat. Given what's going on in Ukraine, it's the proper counter. It's a strange theory. On the other hand, it's very much the only options the Russians have to counterbalance.
So do you think, I mean, Trump's obviously, as you say, talking a lot about the cartels. There's been these boats destroyed, allegedly carrying drugs in the Caribbean. He's now authorized the use of lethal force in Venezuela by the CIA, whatever that will entail. I mean, and I might come back to you on that in a moment, George, but why is he talking so much about the cartels then? Is that just a ploy, really, or is it kind of all true at the same time?
It's really a serious problem because the cartels have begun to move into the United States and operating. And if you remember when there was a time when alcohol was banned and the mafia grew massively in the United States, there is a real threat that these cartels operating in the United States now as retail sellers, not wholesale sellers, are dangerous. So wanting to undermine the cartels is a reasonable option. The evolution of the European war in Ukraine also creates an other dimension to this fear, that if the Russians want to give us a heartburn, like we give them a heartburn in having forces in Europe and so on, they gave us heartburn by having forces in Central America, Nicaragua, as some people may remember, in Colombia as well, and that placed us in a covert war in South America. So if you look at it from the Russian point of view, the Americans are pushing hard in many ways. At the same time, they're trying to set up negotiations. And the U.S. is pushing that to get them to settle on Ukraine on terms they don't want to settle. This is a way to create a kind of tension within the United States that might relieve some pressure on the Russians.
And what about from the perspective of the Venezuelans? I mean, they have long been friendly with Russia. They've got many deals, particularly in energy, oil, that sort of thing. A lot of this goes back to the Cold War as well. I mean, but on the one, both Russia and Venezuela don't have many allies. They kind of need each other in many respects. But you're also getting these pressures from the United States. What does Venezuela do here?
Well, during the Cold War, Venezuela had less covert operations going on than a country like Colombia or the Central American countries and so on. It was a well-to-do country. It had a major oil industry intertwined with American interests, and it was not one of the countries that were in danger of falling. There are other countries that had weak governments and so on. What's happened in this evolution is that while the Cold War was still going on in a way, leftists took power in the country. Now they have little external power to say for it, but America historically has had hostility toward Latin American countries that are particularly anti-American in some ways. And Maduro is seen, not unreasonably, as simultaneously being a left-winger and deeply involved in the drug trade. But we also have to remember, it's not just that we have vessels off the coast of Venezuela. We have massive naval forces forming in the Caribbean in general, south of Cuba, putting Cuba in a kind of tight grip on both sides. But also we are beginning operations or talking trash with the Colombians, if you want to call it that. And we have a fundamental issue with Mexico and other Latin American countries in terms of immigration. So there are many frictions, none of which would rise to this level, except for the Russian deal with the Cubans on defense, which rang many bells. And then the question is, will the Russians try to take advantage of cartels, now possibly in the United States as well, to destabilize things? So it's kind of going back in time, which many people who were there don't know, but it's also a very logical problem expressed in the Monroe Doctrine. So the question is not so much Venezuela, Maduro, and so on. It has to do with the Caribbean as a whole, its security, the future of Cuba, the equivalent of tomahawks in Cuba, and so on and so forth. There are a lot of things coming together on this. And so whenever Trump was talking about the cartels, he seemed to be talking about them as penetrating the United States, for which there is some truth. Now I think the memory goes back to the Russians, how they operate in Latin America, and that doubles it all. So when you see the things off the Venezuelan coast, bear in mind that those ships go throughout the Caribbean. That's become a very tight spot.
Let me ask you, given your sort of experience, I mean, Trump has said that the CIA has been authorized to use military force in Venezuela. I mean, in many ways, that might just be a red herring, but what do you make of that? What do you think that would look like?
Well, you say the obvious. We obviously have CIA operatives in Cuba. And why he wanted to give them away, I don't know. And I think people who are sitting there on the ground kind of were a bit upset. But it's well known that we run intelligence operations like the Russians do all over the place, like even the Venezuelans do all over the place. So the fact that he stated it was, I think, more for domestic consumption in the United States than to frighten the Venezuelans, who are quite sophisticated in what goes on. And I think it was simply worth psychologically saying.
Is there anything else we haven't talked about, George, that you wanted to talk about?
Well, the essential thing is that the Russians are in a very severe threat position by the United States. The threat to put in these missiles into Ukraine was a fundamental threat to Russia. We have not done it, but we're playing with it. And this is an attempt to get the Russians to Budapest, where the next summit is supposed to be held, and end the war. For the Russians to end the war on this basis because of Tomahawk missiles is not easy, but then we haven't sent the Tomahawks yet. On the other hand, the Russians want to signal we have options too, hence this deal with the Cubans. And so what we are is in a preface where both sides are showing the strength, if you will, slamming their hands on the table. none of them have engaged with the other, but each is preparing a situation to the best of their ability to dissuade the other from not doing things that they don't want done. So if the Russians don't want us to give tomahawks to the Ukrainians, which they really don't, a very good thing to do is have a new relationship with Cuba and the thought that they'll put them there. If we are destabilizing various areas like the South Caucasus that were pro-Russian but now are very much in our camp, they may find it desirable to reopen the question of Latin America. So in other words, if you don't want to have a direct war, you can have the war we had in the Cold War, covert operations, spies, and everything else doing it, and undermining various countries, taking it over, and so on. The Russians are not nearly as powerful as the Soviets were, but they still have the same assets. And you have to remember that Putin was a KGB man, Russian intelligence. That's where he came from. And he was certainly aware of and potentially involved in any of these operations against the United States. They say he was only in Germany, but that was bad territory in those days. So what I'm saying is that the Ukrainian war, as wars tend to spread, has a possibility, a distant possibility of it spreading in certain ways. And given the fact that Trump is now saying, look, if you're not going to make a peace, we'll launch the tomahawks. And the Russians don't want to sit at the table if they go to Budapest with the tomahawks looking at the eggs. They want something to counter that. So a great deal of that has to do with that. A great deal of it has to do with the cartels in their own right. A great deal has to do with the nature of Latin America and what it's always been. So you play the cards you have.
And look, finally, George, I mean, what's to stop the US here just going, you know what, Russia, fine, you try and influence Venezuela and Cuba, but if we need to, and there's already been talked about, you know, we can hit them and hurt them if we need to. So we'll call your bluff in this respect, but we'll do what we want with Ukraine.
I think the thing that the Russians have to know, because there are many presidents who've made many threats and didn't carry them out. Trump plays a different game. He doesn't make threats that he's not in a position to carry out. He makes himself appear more rational than he is, and he does a good job of that.
More irrational, do you mean?
Well, he appears that way.
Right.
The idea that if you're not going to have a truce with us, you're not going to make peace over Ukraine, we're going to help the Ukrainians, can be said modestly, moderately, or Trump-wise. But forgetting how he says it, the reality is that we have a real need to bring this war in Ukraine to an end. If the Russians don't want to negotiate it, we may put some more pressure on them. The Russians have a rational desire to find a counter, and they find that counter in Cuba. At the same time, Trump is having the CIA deployed in Venezuela looking for Russians, and so on and so forth. So a game is played out. In other words, the Cold War was not an irrational relationship between the US and Russia. It was a very rational one. And in many ways, as it's evolving in the direction the Cold War was itself, in a very rational way. So we're going to give them grief in Europe, and they're going to give us grief in Latin America.
Well, George, I suppose nothing much really ever changes, at least not with regards to relations between Russia and the US. Thank you very much, as always, for coming on the podcast. Thank you out there for listening. Please go to geopoliticalfutures.com if you want to read George's piece and read about everything from our other analysts who are on there writing about this and everything else going on in the world. But we'll be back again next week with another podcast. But until then, you take care and goodbye.
Talking Geopolitics is brought to you by Geopolitical Futures, your source for geopolitical forecasting and analysis.